Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a faithful man named Eliam, whose story echoes through the ancient book of Job, a narrative inspired by one of the oldest and most profound texts in all of Scripture. This story explores the mysterious nature of suffering and the unwavering faithfulness of God, even in our darkest hours. And it teaches us about trust that transcends understanding, faith that endures beyond reason, and restoration that comes in ways we cannot foresee. As you listen, allow these words filled with faith to enfold you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into God's presence, and let us begin tonight's journey through this blessed story. The sun rose over the land of Uz with the gentle persistence of divine faithfulness, painting the eastern hills in shades of amber and gold that seemed to promise another day of blessing. The air carried the scent of olive trees and fresh bread, baking in clay ovens, mingled with the distant bleating of sheep being led to pasture. In this ancient corner of the world, where the great desert met the fertile valleys, life unfolded with a rhythm as old as the patriarchs themselves. Eliam stood at the edge of his property, watching the dawn break across his fields with the same quiet gratitude he had offered every morning for more years than he could easily count. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, his beard showing the first silver threads of wisdom, his hands strong from honest labor, his eyes clear with the contentment of a life lived in reverence to the Almighty. His robe, simple but well made, hung from broad shoulders that had never shirked from work or from righteousness. There was about him an air of substance, not merely of material wealth, but of something deeper, a rootedness in faith that seemed to anchor him to the very bedrock of creation itself. The fields before him stretched in neat rows, barley and wheat swaying gently in the morning breeze like worshipers bowing in prayer. Beyond the fields, he could see his vineyards climbing the hillside, the vines heavy with clusters that would soon be ready for harvest. Further still, on the slopes where the grass grew thick and green, his flocks grazed under the watchful eyes of his shepherds. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. He knew the count not from pride but from stewardship, for he understood that all he possessed was held in trust from the hand of God. But if you had asked Eliam what his greatest treasure was, he would not have gestured to his fields or his flocks. He would have turned toward his home, where even now his 7 sons and 3 daughters were beginning to stir from sleep. The sound of their voices, calling greetings to one another, sharing the morning meal, planning the day's work and pleasure, this was the music that made his heart sing with thanksgiving. Each child bore something of their father's character: righteousness tempered with mercy, strength balanced by compassion, prosperity worn with humility. Eliam's wife Judith emerged from the house carrying a clay jar of water. She had been his companion for 30 years, a woman of quiet wisdom whose faith matched his own. Her eyes found him at the field's edge, and she smiled, a smile that still held the warmth of their youth together. She set the jar beside the morning fire and began to prepare the first meal, her movements practiced and peaceful, a meditation in themselves. "You were praying again before dawn," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. She knew her husband's habits well. "For the children," Eliam replied, as he always did, "that the Lord might keep them in his ways, that any sin they might have committed, even unknowingly, might be covered by sacrifice and repentance." This was Eliam's custom, faithful and unceasing. After each of his children's feast days, when they would gather at one another's houses to celebrate life's goodness, Eliam would rise early and offer burnt offerings for each of them. "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts," he would think, though he had no evidence of such a thing. It was not suspicion that drove him, but a profound awareness of human frailty and divine holiness. He understood that righteousness was not a possession to be owned, but a path to be walked with careful, reverent steps. The sound of bleating drew his attention to the sheep pens, where his chief shepherd, a weathered man named Jara, was already at work. Jara had served Eliam's household for 20 years, and there was a trust between them that needed no words. The sheep knew Jara's voice, would follow him anywhere, would rest peacefully under his watch. Watching the shepherd among his flock, Eliam often thought of the greater shepherd, the Lord himself, who kept watch over his people with such tender care. As the sun climbed higher, the household came fully to life. Eliam's servants, and there were many, for his household was large, moved about their tasks with the contentment of those well treated. Unlike many wealthy men of that region, Eliam did not rule his household with harshness or greed. His servants ate well, rested on the Sabbath, received fair wages, and were heard when they brought concerns. Some had been with him since they were young, and though they were called servants, they were treated more as extended family. This, too, was part of Eliam's righteousness. He understood that the Lord saw the treatment of the lowly as clearly as he saw the prayers of the mighty. The day unfolded, as so many others had, with work and rest finding their proper balance, with justice and mercy walking hand in hand. Eliam moved through his responsibilities with the steady grace of practice, settling a dispute between two workers over the boundary of their assigned fields, examining the leg of a limping donkey with gentle hands, discussing the coming harvest with his overseer, sharing counsel with a neighbor who sought his wisdom in a difficult matter. In all things, he sought to act with integrity, to speak truth, to do right. It was not burdensome to him. It was simply how he understood life was meant to be lived. As the afternoon heat grew strong, Eliam retreated to the shade of a great fig tree that grew beside his house. It was an ancient tree, older perhaps than his grandfather, its branches spreading wide to create a canopy of dappled light. Here he often came to think, to pray, to simply rest in the presence of the Almighty. The leaves whispered in the breeze with a sound like distant conversation, and Eliam let his mind grow quiet, entering into that space of communion that needed no words. He thought of the goodness of God, of blessings poured out like water from an inexhaustible spring. He thought of his children, each one a gift more precious than all his flocks and fields. He thought of the years stretching behind him, a long road of faithfulness met with faithfulness, of trust rewarded with provision. There was, in his heart, a deep peace, the kind that comes from walking with God through all the seasons of life. But Eliam also carried within him a profound awareness of mystery. He knew, as the wise know, that the ways of the Almighty are not always clear to mortal understanding. He knew that righteousness does not make one immune to the sorrows of this world, that faith is not a shield against all pain, He had seen good people suffer, had seen the wicked prosper for a season. Yet he believed, with a certainty deeper than sight, that the Lord was just, that his purposes were good, that his love endured forever. This belief was not naive. It was tested by observation, refined by contemplation, and held with the strength of mature conviction. As evening approached, his eldest son arrived with an invitation. "Father, we feast tomorrow at my house. All your children will be there. Please, give us your blessing before we gather." Eliam placed his hands on his son's shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him, and spoke words of blessing that came from the deepest well of his faith. He blessed his son's household, his work, his relationships, his walk with God. And as he spoke, he felt again that overwhelming gratitude for the gift of family, for the privilege of seeing his children grow into adults of character and faith. That night, as stars emerged in the darkening sky like the eyes of angels keeping watch, Eliam lay beside his wife in their bed. Through the window, he could see the constellation that his father had taught him to recognize as a boy. The same stars that Abraham had looked upon when God promised to make his descendants as numerous as the lights of heaven. There was a continuity in this, a connection to something larger than himself, larger than his time. He was a link in a chain of faith that stretched backward to the patriarchs and forward to generations yet unborn. "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away," he whispered to himself, though he did not know why these words came to his lips that night. "Blessed be the name of the Lord." It was a prayer he had prayed 1,000 times, an acknowledgment of divine sovereignty that lay at the foundation of all his faith. He did not know, could not know, that these words would soon be tested in ways that would shake him to his very core. Sleep came gently, as it does to those whose conscience is clear and whose trust is settled in something beyond themselves. Eliam's breathing deepened, matched by Judith's beside him, and the house grew quiet, except for the sounds of the night, the call of an owl, the rustling of small creatures, the wind moving through the olive groves. Peace rested over the household like a blessing, and the stars kept their silent vigil overhead. But in the unseen realms, beyond the veil that separates heaven from earth, a conversation was taking place that would change everything. The sons of God had come to present themselves before the Lord, and among them came Satan, the adversary, moving restlessly as he always did, seeking whom he might accuse. The Lord's voice, filled with pride in his servant, echoed through the celestial courts. "Have you considered my servant Eliam? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil." But Satan's response was sharp with cynicism. "Does Eliam fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The ancient question, posed at the dawn of human suffering, do we love God for who he is or only for what he gives? Is faith genuine when it is comfortable, or is it revealed only in the furnace of affliction? Can a human soul maintain its integrity when everything is stripped away? The Lord, who sees into the depths of every heart, knew the answer for Eliam. But the answer would have to be demonstrated, proven, made manifest in the crucible of loss. Permission was granted, with limits. "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." And Satan departed, bent on destruction, eager to prove that human righteousness was nothing more than calculated self-interest. Eliam woke the next morning with no sense of foreboding. The sun rose as it always did, The birds sang their morning prayers, the sheep bleated for their shepherds. He stood again at the edge of his fields, offered again his prayers of thanksgiving, prepared again to walk through another day in faithfulness. He could not see the shadows gathering at the edges of his world, could not know that his life was about to be transformed in ways that would challenge everything he thought he understood about God and suffering and faith. The morning passed peacefully. Eliam walked among his workers, encouraging them in their labor, sharing in their conversations. He checked on a pregnant ewe that Jara had been concerned about and was pleased to find her healthy and near her time. He examined the grain storage, calculating what would be needed for the household and what could be sold or given to those in need. Everything spoke of order, of prosperity, of blessing. Everything seemed secure. It was just past midday when the first messenger arrived. He came running, his face ashen, his breath coming in gasps. Even before he spoke, Eliam felt something cold grip his heart. The man fell to his knees, unable at first to form words. When they came like hammer blows. The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them, and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. Eliam stood very still, his mind struggling to comprehend. 500 yoke of oxen gone, 500 donkeys taken, and his servants, faithful men with families of their own, dead. The magnitude of it was staggering. These were not just animals. They were the means of livelihood for many, the source of sustenance for his household. These were not just servants. They were people he knew by name, whose children played in his courtyards, whose wives wove cloth in his compound. But before he could even begin to process this loss, a second messenger appeared, running with the same desperate speed, bearing news that drove another spike through his heart. The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you. 7,000 sheep. The fire of God. Lightning, perhaps. Or something worse. Something that made it seem as though heaven itself had turned against him. And more servants. More lives lost. Eliam felt his legs weaken, felt the world tilt slightly. Judith appeared beside him, her hand on his arm, her face pale with shock. The third messenger arrived before the second had even finished speaking, words tumbling over one another in horror. The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. 3,000 camels, the wealth of a lifetime, the inheritance he had planned to pass to his children, vanished in an act of violent theft. And again, servants dead, good people who had trusted him to protect them, who had served his household faithfully. The losses were mounting so quickly that Eliam could barely catch his breath between each blow. But there was one more messenger, one more runner approaching with news that would eclipse all the rest, that would transform catastrophic loss into devastation so complete it seemed impossible to bear. This man's face was not just pale but streaked with tears, and when he fell before Eliam, his body shook with sobs that he could not control. "Your sons and daughters," he began, and Eliam's whole world narrowed to those 4 words. They were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you. Silence, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all sound, all motion, all life itself. The words hung in the air like a sentence of death. 10 children, all 10, his sons, his daughters. His legacy, his future, his heart, walking around outside his body in the world, gone, crushed beneath falling stones and timber, dead while they were celebrating, while they were happy, while their father was offering sacrifices on their behalf to keep them safe. Eliam felt something break inside him, felt a chasm open in his soul, so deep and dark it seemed to have no bottom. His knees buckled, and he fell, but he did not fall into despair. In the moment of his greatest loss, when everything had been stripped away, when the foundations of his life had been shattered, Eliam did something that defied all human logic. He tore his robe, the traditional sign of mourning. He shaved his head, marking himself as one in deepest grief. And then, while the dust of his collapse still hung in the air, while his wife wept beside him, while servants gathered in shock and horror, Eliam fell on his face to the ground in worship. "Naked I came from my mother's womb," he said, his voice breaking but his words clear, "and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." It was not resignation. It was not denial. It was a choice made in the crucible of agony to maintain his grip on the one truth that could not be taken from him. The Lord is sovereign, and the Lord is good, even when circumstances scream otherwise. In all this, Scripture would later record, Eliam did not sin or charge God with wrong, but the words spoken in faith did not make the pain less real. They did not bring his children back. They did not restore what was lost. They simply anchored him to something beyond the storm that was destroying his life. The days that followed were a blur of grief and ritual. Bodies had to be recovered, funerals conducted, mourners received. The house that had been filled with laughter and celebration became a place of weeping and lamentation. Judith moved through the rituals like a ghost, her eyes hollow, her voice gone. She had held those babies, nursed them, taught them, watched them grow. And now they were gone, all of them, in a single catastrophic moment. Friends and family came from neighboring regions, drawn by news of the tragedy. They sat with Eliam in the traditional way, in silence, allowing their presence to speak what words could not. For 7 days they sat, as custom dictated, sharing in his mourning. But even as they sat, even as they wept, Eliam could feel something happening inside him, something beyond the immediate agony of loss. Questions were forming, deep questions about the nature of God and suffering and justice. Why? The question echoed in his mind like a bell tolling. Why would God allow this? What purpose could possibly be served by such destruction? What had he done to deserve this? But he did not voice these questions aloud. Not yet. He held them in his heart, turning them over in the darkness of his grief, waiting for understanding that did not come. He continued to pray, though his prayers now tasted like ashes. He continued to worship, though worship felt like pushing against an immovable stone. He maintained his integrity, but the cost was becoming unbearable. Then came the second test, though Eliam did not know it was a test. Satan had been proved wrong about the first attack. Eliam had not cursed God when his possessions and children were taken. But the adversary was not finished. He appeared again before the Lord, and again permission was granted, this time to touch Eliam's own flesh, with only one restriction. His life must be spared. Eliam woke one morning to find his skin erupting in painful sores. They began on his feet and spread rapidly, covering his entire body from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The pain was excruciating, a burning, itching agony that gave no rest day or night. The sores oozed and crusted, became infected. made every movement torture. His appearance became so disfigured that people who had known him for years could barely recognize him. The righteous man, the blessed man, the upright man whom God had praised before all the heavenly host, was reduced to sitting among the ashes outside the city gate, scraping his sores with a piece of broken pottery, his body racked with pain, his life a monument to suffering. Those who had once respected him now crossed the street to avoid him. Children who had once climbed on his knee now stared in horrified fascination. He had become an object of revulsion, a living warning of some unknown sin that must surely have brought such judgment. Even Judith, broken by the loss of her children and now by the disfigurement of her husband, reached a breaking point. She found him among the ashes one evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. She looked at him, this man she had loved for 30 years, now reduced to a suffering shell, and something in her snapped. "Do you still hold fast your integrity?" she asked, and there was bitterness in her voice like vinegar. "Curse God and die." It was not cruelty that made her speak so, but desperation. She wanted an end to his suffering, wanted him to give up the faith that seemed to bring nothing but pain, wanted him to let go and find release, even if that release was death itself. She could not bear to watch him suffer any longer. Eliam looked at his wife, saw the anguish in her eyes, understood the love that lay beneath her bitter words, but he could not do what she asked. "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak," he said gently, without anger. "Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" And though the words came from his lips, and though he believed them to be true, they did not ease his suffering. They did not explain it. They simply located it within a larger framework of trust that transcended understanding. In all this, again, he did not sin with his lips, but oh, how he wanted to. Oh, how the questions burned in his mind, demanding answers. Oh, how the pain tested every fiber of his faith. Word of Eliam's suffering spread throughout the region and eventually reached 3 of his oldest friends, Eliphaz from Teman, Bildad from Shuah, and Zophar from Namath. These were not casual acquaintances, but men who had known Eliam for decades, who had walked with him through many of life's seasons, who loved him genuinely. When they heard of all the evil that had come upon him, they made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. They traveled for days to reach him, and when they first saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. The transformation was so complete, the degradation so profound, that this broken, diseased man sitting in the ash heap bore almost no resemblance to the noble, prosperous friend they had known. When recognition finally came, they were overwhelmed with grief. They raised their voices and wept, tore their robes in solidarity with his mourning, and threw dust on their heads toward heaven. Then, following the custom of deep mourning, they sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. 7 days of silence, 7 days of shared pain, 7 days of presence without explanation. It was a gift, this silence, though none of them knew it yet. It was the last gift of pure comfort they would give him, before their theology got in the way, before their need to explain and justify God's actions would transform comfort into accusation, sympathy into judgment. But on the 8th day, the silence broke, and when it broke from Eliam's own lips, in words of such raw anguish that they shocked even him. The dam of containment burst, and out poured the questions, the pain, the confusion, the rage at the unfairness of it all. "Let the day perish on which I was born," He cried out, his voice echoing off the walls of the city. And the night that said, "A man is conceived," let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. He was not cursing God. He was cursing his own existence, wishing he had never been born, longing for the oblivion of non-being. The pain had become so great that life itself seemed a burden too heavy to bear. He envied the stillborn who never saw the light of day, who never knew the capacity for such suffering. He longed for death as a wearied traveler longs for rest, as a prisoner longs for freedom. Why is light given to him who is in misery, he asked, and life to the bitter in soul who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? The questions poured out, question after question after question, not cursing but questioning, not rejecting God, but demanding audience with him, not abandoning faith, but wrestling with it, struggling to understand how the God he had served so faithfully, the God he had trusted so completely, could allow such suffering to fall upon a righteous man. His friends listened in growing discomfort. This was not what they had expected. They had come to comfort, to console, but also, though they would not have admitted it, to explain. They carried with them a theology as old as the hills, a simple equation that made the moral universe comprehensible. Good is rewarded, evil is punished. If you suffer greatly, you must have sinned greatly. The math was simple, obvious, irrefutable. Eliam's prosperity had been evidence of his righteousness. Therefore, his suffering must be evidence of hidden sin. Eliphaz spoke first, and he spoke with the gentle condescension of one who believes he understands what the sufferer cannot see. If one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yet who can keep from speaking? He began, his tone attempting sympathy but landing closer to correction. Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. The implication was clear. It's easy to give advice when you're not suffering, harder to practice what you preach when the pain is your own. But Eliphaz went further, driving toward the conclusion his theology demanded. Remember, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. There it was, the accusation wrapped in rhetorical question. Innocent people don't suffer like this, Eliphaz was saying. The upright are not cut off. Therefore, though you appeared righteous, you must have plowed iniquity in secret. Your suffering is not mysterious. It is deserved. Repent of your hidden sin, and surely God will restore you. Eliam listened, feeling a new kind of pain add itself to the physical agony and emotional devastation. The pain of being misunderstood, of being judged by those who claimed to comfort him. His friends, sitting in the dust beside him, had become his accusers. Their theology required it. If God is just, and God must be just, then suffering is always proportionate to sin. The equation must balance. And if Eliam is suffering this greatly, then Eliam must have sinned this greatly. But Eliam knew his own heart. He was not claiming to be perfect. He had never claimed that. He knew he was human, prone to error, in need of grace. But he also knew he had not committed the kind of heinous secret sin that would warrant this level of devastation. He had not defrauded anyone, had not oppressed the poor, had not worshipped false gods, had not violated his integrity in any fundamental way. And so the question remained, why? Why was this happening? The conversation continued for days, turning into a long debate that circled the same ground again and again. Bildad spoke next, appealing to tradition. Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. The cruelty of this statement took Eliam's breath away, to suggest that his children, his beloved children, crushed in the prime of their lives, deserved their fate because of some sin, was almost more than he could bear. But Bildad continued, oblivious to the wound he was inflicting, if you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation, pure and upright. The very words God himself had used to describe Eliam. But his friends could not see it. They were blinded by their theology, their need to make God's actions comprehensible, to maintain a universe where righteousness is always rewarded and sin is always punished. To admit that Eliam might be suffering despite his righteousness, not because of hidden sin, would be to admit that the moral universe is more complex than their simple equations allowed. It would be to admit that God's ways are not always immediately comprehensible, that suffering sometimes comes without clear cause, that the rain falls on the just and the unjust without regard to merit. And so they argued, these four men sitting in the dust, surrounded by the ashes of Eliam's ruined life. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar took turns presenting their case, each speech becoming more pointed, more accusatory, more convinced that Eliam's refusal to confess his sin was itself evidence of pride and obstinacy. And Eliam, in growing frustration and anguish, defended his integrity not from pride, but from honesty, from a genuine need to understand what was happening to him. Though I am in the right, I cannot answer him, Eliam cried out at one point, speaking not to his friends, but toward heaven. I must appeal for mercy to my accuser. If I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice, for he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. Without cause. That was the heart of it. Eliam's suffering had no cause proportionate to its magnitude. He had not earned this. He had not deserved this. And yet it had come upon him with the force of a whirlwind, destroying everything he held dear, reducing him to this broken figure in the ash heap. Why do the wicked live, reach old age, and grow mighty in power? He asked, challenging the simple theology his friends insisted upon. Their offspring are established in their presence, and their descendants before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and no rod of God is upon them. He had observed this his whole life, had seen wicked men prosper, oppressors grow wealthy, the unrighteous flourish. It was not that wickedness always escaped judgment, but neither was it true that righteousness always brought blessing, or that suffering always indicated sin. The debate raged on day after day, week after week. Zophar, the youngest of the three friends, and perhaps the most dogmatic, pressed the attack with particular vigor. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. The stunning arrogance of this statement, to claim to know the hidden counsels of God, to measure out another man's supposed guilt with such precision, revealed how far his friends had fallen from genuine comfort into self-righteous judgment. But through it all, despite his anguish, despite his questions, despite his desperate desire to understand why God seemed to be treating him as an enemy, Eliam maintained one unshakable conviction. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. This was not passive resignation. It was active, wrestling faith. It was Jacob refusing to let go of the angel until he received a blessing. It was trust that transcended understanding, that persisted despite all evidence, that held on to God even when God seemed to have let go of him. I know that my Redeemer lives, Eliam declared at one point, his voice rising with sudden conviction, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. It was a profound statement of faith, spoken from the depths of suffering. Even if this body is completely destroyed, even if I die in this ash heap, even if restoration never comes in this life, I will see God. I will stand before him. I will have my answer. The faith was not contingent on immediate relief or explanation. It was faith for the long haul, faith that stretched beyond the grave, faith in a Redeemer who would ultimately make all things right. The friends eventually fell silent, exhausted by their own arguments, frustrated by Eliam's refusal to confess the sin they were certain he must have committed. They had come to comfort, but their comfort had turned to accusation. They had come to help, but their help had only added to Eliam's burden. In their need to defend God, they had misrepresented both God and their friend. Into this silence came a new voice. A young man named Elihu, who had been listening to the entire debate without speaking, finally could contain himself no longer. He was angry at Eliam for justifying himself rather than God, and angry at the three friends for condemning Eliam without offering any real wisdom. His speeches were long and passionate, full of youthful intensity and the conviction that he alone could see clearly what the older men had missed. I am young in years, and you are aged, he began, showing appropriate deference even as he prepared to rebuke them all. Therefore, I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak and many years teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Elihu's contribution was significant. He rejected the friend's theology that suffering always indicates sin, but he also challenged Eliam's assumption that he could demand an accounting from God. Behold, God is exalted in his power, Elihu declared. Who is a teacher like him? Who has prescribed for him his way, or who can say, you have done wrong? He proposed a different understanding of suffering, not as punishment for sin, but as discipline, as education, as a means by which God speaks to human hearts. He delivers the afflicted by their affliction, Elihu said, and opens their ear by adversity. Suffering, in this view, was not primarily judicial, but pedagogical. God was not punishing Eliam, but teaching him something, refining him, preparing him for some deeper understanding or greater purpose. It was closer to the truth than what the three friends had offered, but it still did not fully account for the mystery of Eliam's suffering. It still tried to fit divine action into human logic to make comprehensible what was not yet meant to be understood. And then, as Elihu's speeches drew to a close, as the young man's passion spent itself in words and argument, something changed in the atmosphere. The wind began to blow, at first gently, and then with increasing strength, not with violence, but with presence. The air itself seemed to change, becoming charged with something beyond description, something that felt both ancient and immediate, like the first breath of creation itself. Eliam looked up from his place among the ashes, his diseased eyes squinting against dust that now swirled in small eddies around the gathering. The young man, Elihu, paused mid-sentence, his passionate words trailing off as he too felt the shift in atmosphere. The three older friends, who had been listening with varying degrees of approval to Elihu's speeches, grew very still. Even the servants, who had been tending the evening fire some distance away, stopped their work and turned their faces toward the east, where dark clouds were forming with unnatural speed. The wind grew stronger, and within it came a sound. At first, it was indistinguishable from the wind itself, but gradually it resolved into something more, a voice. If a voice could be made of thunder and whisper simultaneously, if a voice could shake the earth and caress the soul in the same moment. It was the voice of the Lord speaking from the whirlwind, and when it came, all human speech ceased entirely. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? The voice rolled across the hills like the breaking of waves on an endless shore, and Eliam felt the words strike him not with anger, but with a profound, overwhelming presence. This was not the voice of a distant deity, pronouncing judgment from an unreachable throne. This was the voice of Creator to creature, of the one who knew him completely, speaking directly to the core of his being. Eliam pressed his face deeper into the dust, his body trembling, not from fear of punishment, but from the sheer magnitude of encountering the infinite. Every cell in his body seemed to recognize the presence of the one who had spoken it into existence. The pain of his sores, which had been a constant screaming agony, faded into insignificance. The grief for his children, which had felt like a physical weight crushing his chest, was still present, but somehow held within something larger. He was standing, no lying, in the presence of mystery itself. Dress for action like a man, the voice continued, and there was something in it that was not harshness, but invitation. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Eliam had demanded an audience with God, had called out for the Almighty to explain himself, to justify these incomprehensible sufferings. And now, God was here, but not as defendant in some cosmic court. God was here as God. And the questions were not going to flow in the direction Eliam had expected. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? The voice asked, and suddenly Eliam's mind was flooded with images beyond human comprehension. He saw or felt or knew the moment of creation, when the earth was called into being out of nothing. He glimpsed the joy of it, the precision, the staggering complexity and beauty of the initial act that set all existence in motion. Tell me, if you have understanding, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? The questions came like waves, each one expanding Eliam's awareness, forcing him to confront the vast difference between finite and infinite, between creature and creator, between the tiny scope of his own existence and the boundless reality of the one who made all things. But they were not cruel questions, not dismissive or mocking. They were questions designed to teach, to lead, to expand his vision beyond the narrow confines of his own suffering. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? The images continued to unfold. Dawn breaking over the curved edge of the earth, the precise tilt and rotation that brought light and darkness in their seasons, the mathematics of orbit and spin that made day and night possible. Eliam saw the earth as God saw it, a sphere of stunning beauty, turning in the void, light chasing darkness in an eternal dance that had continued for countless generations. Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? The questions probe the boundaries of existence itself. Eliam, who had wished for death, who had longed for the stillness of the grave, was being asked to consider what lay beyond that veil. Had he mapped the territory of death? Did he understand its mechanisms, its purposes, its place in the greater order? Could he speak with authority about these mysteries? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. The vision expanded further. Eliam saw the world from a height impossible to human eyes, the great deserts spreading like golden blankets, the oceans vast beyond measuring, mountains rising in chains across continents, rivers threading through valleys like veins carrying life. He saw the land of Uz, his home, as a tiny corner of an incomprehensibly large creation. His fields, which had seemed so significant, were less than a speck of dust in the scope of the world. And yet, and this was the stunning part, the Creator knew them, knew each furrow, each seed planted, each sheaf harvested. The voice continued, asking about light and darkness, about the storehouses of snow and hail, about the channels through which rain is distributed across the earth. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion? The stars Eliam had watched all his life, the familiar patterns he had used to mark seasons and navigate by night, were suddenly revealed as part of a cosmic choreography beyond his imagining. Those points of light were not merely decorations in the sky, but vast suns, perhaps with their own worlds, all held in their courses by the same hand that had formed Eliam himself in his mother's womb. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightnings, that they may go and say to you, "Here we are"? The questions touched on weather, on the systems that brought rain to the earth, on lightning that struck where it would. Eliam, who had lost his sheep to the fire of God falling from heaven, was being asked to consider the complexity of atmospheric phenomena, the intricate balance of moisture and heat and electricity that made storms possible. Then the question shifted from the inanimate to the living. Who has put wisdom in the inward parts or given understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom? Or who can tilt the waterskins of the heavens? The focus moved to knowledge itself, to consciousness, to the mystery of awareness and thought. How did the mind work? What was wisdom, and where did it originate? Could Eliam explain his own ability to think, to question, to wonder? Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens or lie in wait in their thicket? Now the questions turned to the animal kingdom, and suddenly Eliam was seeing creation from a radically different perspective. The lion, which he might have viewed as a threat to his flocks, was revealed as a creature with its own dignity, its own place in the order, its own relationship with the Creator who provided for it. God hunted for the lion. God satisfied the appetites of the young lions. The predator, no less than the prey, was held in divine care. Who provides for the raven its prey when its young ones cry to God for help and wander about for lack of food? Even the raven, a scavenger bird unclean according to the law, was seen and known and cared for by God. The baby ravens, crying out in their hunger, had a listener. Their need was not ignored or dismissed. In the vast economy of creation, provision was made even for the least and lowest of creatures. The discourse continued, building and expanding. Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? The questions probe the cycles of animal reproduction, the timing of births, the behavior of wild creatures that humans rarely witnessed. In remote mountain regions, where no human eye could see, where it would seem that life and death happened without witness, God was present. God knew. God attended to these hidden births, these secret struggles for survival. Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? The portrait of the war horse that followed was magnificent, a creature of power and beauty, fearless in battle, pawing the ground in eagerness, laughing at fear. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. The horse was celebrated not as a mere tool, but as a being of remarkable qualities, created with specific characteristics for specific purposes. The mane flowing from its neck, the strength in its shoulders, the courage in its heart, all were gifts designed and bestowed by the Creator. Is it by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings toward the south? The questions turn to migration, to the mysterious instinct that drove birds to travel thousands of miles between seasons. The hawk, soaring on thermals, navigating by means humans still barely understood, was following wisdom placed within it by the one who made it. Eliam, who had watched hawks circle over his fields, had never considered the marvel of their internal compass, the precision of their seasonal journeys. Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the rock he dwells and makes his home, on the rocky crag and stronghold. From there he spies out the prey, his eyes behold it from far away. The eagle's nest, built in inaccessible places, the bird's extraordinary vision that could spot a rabbit from heights, where the rabbit appeared as a mere dot. These were more wonders layered upon wonders. The eagle's young ones suck up blood, the voice continued, and where the slain are, there is the eagle. Even in death, even in the grim work of consuming carrion, there was a place in the order, a role to be fulfilled. Eliam lay in the dust, his mind reeling. He had wanted answers. He had wanted to know why he suffered, but instead of answers, he was being given something else entirely: perspective. He was being taken on a tour of creation so vast, so complex, so staggeringly beautiful and terrible and mysterious that his own suffering, while not diminished in its pain, was being located within a context almost too large to comprehend. The voice paused, and in that pause, Eliam became aware again of his own body, of the sores that covered him, of the ashes beneath his face. But something had shifted. The questions had not explained his suffering, had not told him why his children died or why he sat diseased among the ashes. But they had done something perhaps more important. They had reminded him of who God was, and by extension, who he was not. Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? The voice came again, gentler now, but no less profound. He who argues with God, let him answer it. Eliam lifted his head slightly, dust clinging to his tear-streaked face. His diseased lips opened, and his voice, which had been so eloquent in complaint, so passionate in questioning, came out small and broken. Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. It was not the answer of someone silenced by force or intimidated into submission. It was the answer of someone who had encountered something so far beyond his categories of understanding that further argument seemed absurd. He had demanded that God answer him, and God had answered not by explaining the reasons for suffering, but by revealing himself, And in that revelation, Eliam's questions had not been answered so much as dissolved. They had not become less important, but they had become less central. Something larger was at work, something he could not begin to fathom. But the voice was not finished. The whirlwind swirled again, and the Lord spoke a second time, and now the questions went even deeper, probing not just the mysteries of creation, but the moral structure of the universe itself. Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? The question struck at the heart of Eliam's complaint. In his suffering, in his demand for explanation, had he been trying to establish his own righteousness at the expense of God's? Had his questions been attempts to put God on trial, to force the Creator to justify himself according to the creature's standards? Have you an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like his? The contrast was being drawn starkly now. Eliam had questioned God's justice, God's goodness, God's wisdom. But did he have the power to back up his judgments? Could he enforce what he deemed right? Did he have the strength to remake the world according to his own vision of how things should be? Adorn yourself with majesty and dignity. Clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. The challenge was clear. If you think you can run the universe better, try it. Take on the robes of judge. Execute justice according to your understanding. Humble the proud. Punish the wicked. See if you can manage even a fraction of what you demand that I do. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. It was a challenge impossible to meet, and that was precisely the point. Eliam could not save himself. He could not save others. He could not execute perfect justice, could not manage the moral order of the universe, could not even understand the full implications of his own actions, let alone judge the actions of God. The discourse turned then to two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, beasts of such power and majesty that they stood as symbols of the untamable forces of creation itself. Behold Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold his strength in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. The description of Behemoth was of a creature massive beyond measure, peaceful in its grazing, but possessing strength that no human could match. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. The beast could not be defeated by human means. It stood outside human control, a reminder that there were forces in creation that humans could not master, could not domesticate, could not bend to their will, and yet God had made it. God sustained it. God alone could approach it with authority. Then came Leviathan, and the description was even more awe-inspiring and terrifying. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? The creature was untamable, beyond human dominion. The questions piled up, each one highlighting the utter futility of human attempts to control this beast. Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your girls? The image was almost comical. Leviathan, this monster of the deep, as a pet bird or a plaything for children. The absurdity highlighted the unbridgeable gap between human power and the forces represented by Leviathan. Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Anyone foolish enough to attack Leviathan would have an experience so terrifying that they would never attempt it a second time. The description continued, painting a picture of a creature armored with impenetrable scales, breathing fire and smoke, stirring up the deep like a boiling pot. Upon earth there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. Leviathan was indomitable, fearless, supreme in its domain. And the point, woven throughout the description, was clear. If humans could not master Leviathan, how could they presume to question the one who made it? Eliam listened to these descriptions with a kind of terrible wonder. He had complained that God had made him a target, had treated him as an enemy. But if God truly treated anyone as an enemy, with the full force of divine power, what human could stand for even a moment? The fact that Eliam was still breathing, still capable of questioning, still held in existence, was itself evidence of restraint, of mercy, of love beyond his understanding. The wind began to calm. The voice, which had thundered through the whirlwind, grew quieter. The lesson was complete, though it was a lesson that could not be fully absorbed in a single hearing, a lesson that would take a lifetime and beyond to fully comprehend. Eliam had been taken on a journey through creation, from the foundations of the earth to the heights of the stars, from the birth of mountain goats to the flight of the eagle, from the power of the horse to the terror of Leviathan. He had been shown a universe of such complexity, such beauty, such careful design and wild freedom that his mind could barely hold it all. And in the showing, he had been given not answers, but something better. He had been given God, not explanations for his suffering, but the presence of the one who held all suffering, all joy, all existence itself within his hands. The questions remained. Why had his children died? Why had he lost everything? Why did the righteous suffer while the wicked prospered? These questions were not answered with neat theological formulas, but they were placed within a context so vast that they ceased to be the only questions that mattered. Eliam pulled himself up from the dust, his body still racked with pain, but his spirit strangely steadied. His diseased hands trembled as he lifted them in a gesture of worship and surrender. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse and emotion, but the words came from the deepest place of his being. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. It was a declaration of God's sovereignty, but spoken now not as abstract doctrine, but as lived truth. He had heard the voice from the whirlwind. He had been confronted with the scope of divine power and wisdom. He knew, not as intellectual assent, but as visceral reality, that God was able to accomplish whatever he purposed. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Eliam quoted back the question that had opened God's speech, applying it now to himself. Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. He was confessing, not sin in the usual sense, but the limits of his understanding. He had spoken of God's ways as if he could comprehend them, as if he could judge them, as if he stood on a level where such judgment was possible. But he had been speaking of things beyond his grasp, mysteries too deep for mortal minds to plumb. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Again, he quoted the divine words back, acknowledging them, accepting them, Then came the words that marked the hinge point of his entire journey. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. This was the crucial distinction. Before, Eliam's knowledge of God had been second-hand. He had learned about God from his father, from the traditions of his people, from the teachings passed down through generations. He had believed these things, had lived according to them, had been righteous and upright based on them. But it had been knowledge at one remove, knowledge about rather than knowledge of. Now, having encountered God directly, having been addressed by the voice from the whirlwind, having been taken on this cosmic tour of creation, his knowledge had become immediate and personal. He had seen with his own eyes, not physical eyes, but the eyes of the soul that perceive spiritual reality. And this seeing changed everything. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. The words could sound harsh, but they were not self-loathing. They were the natural response of someone who had seen themselves in proper proportion, who had encountered the infinite and realized how small and finite they truly were. It was not that Eliam was worthless, but that he had overestimated his own understanding, his own righteousness, his own claim on God. The dust and ashes in which he repented were the very dust and ashes where he sat in his suffering. But now they meant something different. They were not just the place of mourning, but the place of truth. This is what we are, dust and ashes, and yet breathed into life by God, loved by God, addressed by God. As the words left Eliam's lips, a remarkable thing happened. The sun, which had been hidden by the clouds of the whirlwind, broke through. Light streamed across the landscape, painting everything in gold. Eliam closed his eyes against the brightness, but he could feel the warmth on his ravaged skin. And for the first time in weeks, the burning agony of his sores began, very slightly, to ease. His friends, who had been frozen in terror throughout God's speeches, began to stir. They looked at each other, then at Eliam, then at the clearing sky. Eliphaz, the oldest, ventured to speak, his voice shaky. Eliam, what just happened? But before Eliam could respond, the voice came again, not from a whirlwind now, but clearly present in the air around them. And this time, the words were directed not at Eliam, but at his three friends. My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Eliam has. The words sent a shock through the three men. They had come to comfort Eliam, but had ended up accusing him, insisting that his suffering proved hidden sin, defending God with arguments that misrepresented both God and Eliam, and now they were being called to account. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Eliam, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Eliam shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Eliam has. The irony was profound. Eliam, who had questioned God, who had demanded answers, who had come close to charging God with injustice, was being commended for speaking rightly. Meanwhile, his friends, who had defended God at every turn, who had insisted on God's justice even when it meant accusing their friend falsely, were being rebuked. The difference was that Eliam had spoken honestly from his anguish, had wrestled with genuine faith, had refused to accept easy answers that violated his experience of reality. His friends, by contrast, had prioritized theological correctness over truth, had cared more about defending their doctrine than about understanding their friend's pain or honestly engaging with the complexities of suffering. And now, in a beautiful reversal, Eliam, the one who had been judged by his friends, was being called to intercede for them. The one who sat in ashes would pray for those who sat in self-righteousness. The accused would become the advocate. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar left immediately to gather the animals for sacrifice. Eliam watched them go, and surprisingly, he felt no bitterness, no vindication, no satisfaction at seeing them humbled. Instead, he felt compassion. They had meant well. They had come to comfort him. They had sat with him for 7 days in silence. Their theology had failed them, but their hearts had been in the right place, at least initially. He would pray for them gladly. In the days that followed, as the sacrifices were offered and Eliam prayed for his friends, something else began to happen. The sores that covered his body began to heal. It started slowly, the angry inflammation subsiding, the weeping wounds drying, new skin forming over damaged flesh. It was painful in its own way, the itching and tightness of healing skin, but it was a good pain, a pain that spoke of restoration rather than destruction. Judith, who had maintained her distance during the worst of his suffering, began to draw close again. She brought water to wash him, ointment to soothe the healing skin, clean clothes to replace the filthy rags he had worn in the ash heap. She didn't speak much at first. The wound between them was still too raw, her bitter words still echoing in the silence. But gradually, as she cared for him, as she saw the light returning to his eyes, something began to heal between them as well. "I'm sorry," she whispered one evening, as she helped him change the dressing on a particularly stubborn sore on his back. "I'm so sorry. I should not have told you to curse God." Eliam reached back and took her hand, holding it gently. "You spoke from a broken heart. You had lost your children. You were watching your husband die by inches. Your grief was speaking. But you didn't curse him," she said, tears running down her face. "Even when I told you to, even when it would have been easier." "I came close," Eliam admitted, "closer than you know. The questions I asked, the things I said, I questioned everything I thought I knew about God." "But he answered you," Judith said, wonder creeping into her voice. "The Lord answered you." "He did," Eliam agreed. "Not the way I expected, not with explanations or justifications. But he answered. He showed me everything. Judith, he showed me the whole world, the foundations of the earth, the stars, the animals, creatures I never imagined. He made me see how vast it all is, how much I don't understand, how much I can't understand. And somehow, in all that vastness, I felt known, seen, held." They sat together in silence for a long time, Eliam's healing hand clasped in Judith's work-worn one, both of them beginning to process the enormity of what had happened. They had lost everything. Their children were still dead. That pain had not gone away and would not go away, not in this life. But something had shifted. Some fundamental trust had been restored. Some deeper foundation had been revealed beneath the ruins of their life. Word of what had happened, the voice from the whirlwind, Eliam's restoration, began to spread throughout the region. People who had avoided him during his suffering now came with offerings of comfort and restoration. His brothers and sisters, whom he had not seen in months, arrived with gifts and embraces. Friends from distant towns made the journey to sit with him, to hear his story, to marvel at the change in him. "We heard you were dead," one cousin said bluntly. "When we heard about the children and then about your illness, we thought." "I came close," Eliam said simply. "There were days I wished for it, but the Lord had other plans." The cousin looked around at the ash heap where Eliam still sat, though now on a mat rather than directly on the ground. "They say you heard the voice of God. Is it true?" Eliam nodded slowly. "It's true. I can't fully describe it, but yes, he spoke to me from the whirlwind." "What did he say?" another visitor asked, leaning forward eagerly. How could he explain? How could he compress that experience into words? Eliam thought for a moment, then said, "He asked me questions about the earth, the stars, the animals, about whether I could do what he does, understand what he understands, manage what he manages. He showed me my place, not to humiliate me, but to help me see truly. I am small, but I am known. I am finite, but I am held. I don't understand his ways, but I trust his character." The visitors brought more than comfort. They brought tangible help. Each one gave him money, a piece of silver, and a ring of gold. As the gifts accumulated, Eliam realized that the Lord was not just healing his body, but restoring his fortunes. It wasn't immediate or magical, but it was real. The means of rebuilding were being provided. The foundation for a new life was being laid. With the money that came, Eliam began to reinvest in flocks and herds. He was careful this time, starting small, remembering the lessons of loss. He bought sheep first, watching them multiply in the care of faithful shepherds. He acquired a few camels, then more, as the first proved their worth. Oxen and donkeys followed, each purchase made with prayer and careful thought. The Lord blessed Eliam's latter days more than his beginning. Over the years that followed, his flocks grew to twice what they had been before. 14,000 sheep grazed on his hills, where once there had been 7,000. 6,000 camels bore his goods along the trading routes, where once there had been 3,000. 1,000 yoke of oxen pulled his plows, where once there had been 500. 1,000 female donkeys multiplied his herds, doubling the 500 he had lost. But the greatest restoration, the most unexpected blessing, was still to come. Judith came to him one morning with news that made his heart, which he thought was beyond such feelings, leap with joy. "Eliam," she said, her voice trembling, "I am with child." He looked at her in wonder. They were not young anymore. They had lost their children, had accepted that their line would end with them, that they would grow old without grandchildren to comfort them. But now there was this impossible gift, this sign of life rising from the ashes of death. The pregnancy was not easy. Judith was older now, and the losses she had endured had marked her body as well as her soul. But she carried the child with fierce determination, and when the time came, she delivered a daughter. They named her Jemima, which means dove, for she was a sign of peace, of new beginnings, of the Lord's favor returning. 3 more children followed, 2 more daughters, Keziah and Karen Hapuch, and then, to their overwhelming joy, a son. Each birth was a miracle, each child a gift beyond measure. These children could not replace the ones who had died. Nothing could do that. The grief for his first sons and daughters would remain with Eliam until his own death, a tender scar that never fully healed. But these new children were not replacements. They were additions, signs that life continued, that blessing could follow curse, that joy could emerge from sorrow. As the years passed and Eliam's strength returned fully, he found that his reputation had changed. People sought him out now not just for business advice, but for wisdom about suffering. Those who faced their own trials, who wrestled with questions about God's justice and goodness, who sat in their own ash heaps, wondering if they had been abandoned, these came to Eliam, and he received them with a compassion born of experience. "Does the pain ever go away?" a man asked him once, a man whose own child had just died. Eliam considered the question carefully. "No, he said finally. The pain doesn't go away. Not completely. I still think of my first children every day. I still wonder what they would have looked like as they aged, what kind of adults they would have become, what grandchildren they might have given me. The grief is still there, but he paused, searching for the right words. It doesn't have the last word anymore. It's part of my story, but it's not the end of my story. How do you bear it? The man asked, tears streaming down his face. I don't. Not on my own, Eliam replied. I bear it because I am born. The Lord carries what I cannot carry, and I've learned, am still learning, that His purposes are larger than my understanding. That doesn't make the pain less real, but it does make it bearable, meaningful even, though I can't always see how. He spoke to others of the voice from the whirlwind, of the questions that had shattered his certainty and rebuilt his faith on firmer foundations. I learned that God doesn't owe me explanations, he would say, but He gave me something better. He gave me Himself. He showed me that the universe is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than I imagined, and that I am held within it by hands stronger than the storm. Women who had lost children came to learn from Judith, who could speak with authority about the long valley of grief and the slow climb back toward light. You never stop being their mother, she would tell them. They are still yours, still part of you, even though they're gone. But you can be mother to others too. Love doesn't diminish by being shared. It multiplies. The love I give my daughters now doesn't take anything away from the love I still hold for the children I lost. Eliam's daughters grew into women of remarkable beauty, both physical and spiritual. The scripture would later note that in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Eliam's daughters, but their beauty was more than appearance. There was a depth to them, a wisdom beyond their years, as if they had inherited something of their father's hard-won understanding. And in a radical departure from custom, Eliam gave them an inheritance alongside their brothers, treating them as equals, recognizing that his daughters were as much his legacy as his sons. The family gatherings that had once ended in tragedy now became occasions of joy. Eliam's children would come together to feast and celebrate, and this time their father's prayers were answered not with disaster, but with continued blessing. He no longer worried obsessively about hidden sins, no longer lived in fear that prosperity would be snatched away. He had learned that the Lord's purposes were not dependent on his perfect performance, that blessing was not a wage earned, but a gift given. Yet he remained humble, never forgetting the ash heap, never losing touch with those who suffered. His prosperity in his latter years did not make him proud or complacent. He remembered too well what it was to lose everything, to sit in dust and scrape his sores with pottery shards, to question whether God had abandoned him. That memory kept him generous, kept him compassionate, kept him aware that circumstances could change in an instant. He would often walk to the place where he had sat during his suffering, the place where the ash heap had been. It was clean now, just a patch of ground like any other, but for him it remained sacred. Here he had met God. Here he had been broken and remade. Here he had learned the difference between hearing about God and seeing God with his own eyes. Sometimes visitors would find him there, standing in quiet contemplation. They might have expected to find him at the center of his bustling household, managing his vast flocks, overseeing his servants, and indeed, he did those things, fulfilled those responsibilities. But he also needed these moments of return, these times of remembrance, when he could touch again the foundation of rock that lay beneath all his restored prosperity. One such visitor, A young man struggling with his own questions about suffering asked him once, "Do you well, nor does it bring back the dead?" But a young woman spoke up, her child on her hip. Perhaps that is not what the poem means to do. Perhaps it means to fill something else, something that neither water nor resurrection can touch. Eliam looked at her with gratitude. "Yes," he said softly, "the Lord does not promise that we will never walk through the valley. He promises that when we do, we will not walk alone, that even in the darkest places there is a shepherd who knows our name, who counts us precious, who guides us through." The conversation continued as the day faded into evening, and as people dispersed to their homes, several approached Eliam privately, a man whose business had failed, a woman whose husband had left her, an elderly father whose son no longer spoke to him. Each carried their own valley of shadow, their own table set in the presence of enemies, their own need for a shepherd's comfort. To each, Eliam listened with the patience born of his own suffering. He did not offer quick solutions or empty platitudes. He simply shared what he had learned, that faith was not about having all the answers, but about maintaining trust even when answers did not come. That righteousness was not a transaction, goodness exchanged for blessing, but a relationship, a walking with God through whatever terrain the journey required. "I do not understand why my children died," he told the grieving father. "I may never understand, not in this life, but I know the one who held them as they passed from this world to the next. And I know he is good, even when I cannot see how." The seasons turned. Autumn gave way to winter, winter to spring. Eliam's flocks multiplied. His fields produced abundantly. His daughters grew in wisdom and beauty, their laughter filling the house that had once echoed with mourning. His younger sons learned at his knee, not just about managing flocks and fields, but about living with integrity, about treating servants with dignity, about seeing the image of God in every person they encountered. On Sabbaths, the family would gather, and often Eliam would tell stories. Not just the story of his own suffering that was told, but sparingly, and always with emphasis on what he had learned rather than what he had lost. He also told the old stories, the ones passed down from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, stories of faith tested and proven, of promises kept across generations, of a God who was faithful even when his people were faithless. "Why do you think God tested our father Abraham?" one of his sons asked one Sabbath evening. Eliam considered the question carefully. "I do not know that God tests us to learn something about us. He already knows our hearts better than we know them ourselves. Perhaps he tests us so that we might learn something about ourselves, so that we might discover reserves of faith we did not know we possessed, so that our trust might become not just belief we inherited, but conviction we have earned through our own journey." "But is that fair?" his daughter Keziah asked, her young face serious. "Why should we have to suffer to prove our faith?" "I do not think it is about proving anything," Eliam replied gently. "Faith that has never been tested is like a root that has never had to dig deep for water. It may flourish in good conditions, but when drought comes, it has nothing to sustain it. The testing does not create faith. It reveals the faith that is already there, and in the revealing, it deepens and strengthens it." Jemima, his eldest daughter, spoke thoughtfully. "So, when you were sitting in the ashes, your faith was being deepened?" "In a way, yes, though I would not have used that word at the time. At the time, I felt like my faith was being destroyed. But looking back, I can see that what was being destroyed was my false understanding of faith. I thought faith meant that if I was righteous, God would protect me from suffering. I thought blessing was a reward for goodness. But I learned that blessing is grace. It is given, not earned, and that God's presence is not dependent on our circumstances. He was with me in prosperity, and He was with me in the ash heap, and He is with me now in restoration. His faithfulness is the constant. My circumstances are the variable. The children pondered this in silence. Outside, the stars were emerging, the same stars Eliam had looked at from his bed of ashes, the same stars that had looked down on Abraham and Moses and David. There was comfort in this continuity, in the knowledge that he was part of something larger than himself, a story that began before him and would continue after him. One evening, as Eliam was walking through his olive grove in the cool of the day, he came upon a stranger sitting beneath one of the trees. The man was young, perhaps 20 years old, and his clothes marked him as a traveler from a distant region. His face was drawn with grief, and he held his head in his hands. Eliam approached quietly. "Peace be with you, stranger." The young man looked up, startled, then tried to compose himself. "And with you, sir. Forgive me for trespassing on your land. I was resting, and I fear I fell into despair." "You are welcome to rest here," Eliam said, settling himself on the ground nearby, his movements slow and careful, giving the young man space to decide whether he wished to talk. "This tree has witnessed many prayers, many tears. It does not judge." They sat in silence for a time. A dove called from the branches above. The evening breeze stirred the leaves with a sound like gentle rain. Finally, the young man spoke. "I have lost everything. My father's business failed, and creditors took our land, our home, everything. My father died of grief, and my mother soon followed. I have nothing. I am nothing." Eliam listened, his heart stirring with recognition. How many times had he felt exactly that? "You are not nothing," he said quietly. "You are a man breathing the air of life, thinking thoughts, feeling pain, and that pain, though it is hard to bear, proves that you are fully alive, fully human. What good is being alive when there is nothing to live for?" "I understand that question," Eliam said. "I have asked it myself. Let me tell you a story, if you will hear it." The young man nodded, and Eliam began to speak. He told the story of his own losses, not lingering on the details of horror, but focusing on the journey through. He spoke of sitting in ashes, of friends who accused rather than comforted, of questioning God with a boldness that shocked even himself. He spoke of the voice from the whirlwind, of being taken on a tour of creation so vast that his own suffering, while not diminished, was placed within a context larger than he could comprehend. "And did that make the pain go away?" the young man asked. "No," Eliam admitted. "The pain of losing my children has never gone away. There are still days when I think of them and weep. But it changed something fundamental about how I understood my life. I realized that I was not the center of the story. That sounds harsh, perhaps, but it was actually liberating. My suffering was not the most important thing in the universe. It was one note in a symphony so complex and beautiful that I could not begin to understand it. And the composer knew every note, valued every note, wove even the dissonant ones into something ultimately harmonious." The young man was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "I do not know if I can believe that." "That is honest," Eliam replied. "Doubt is not the opposite of faith. Certainty without testing is. You are in the wilderness right now. I cannot tell you how long you will be there or what you will find on the other side, but I can tell you that you will not be there alone, even when it feels like you are. The shepherd walks through every valley with his sheep." "How do you know?" The question was almost a challenge, because I was in a valley so dark I thought I would never see light again. And I survived, not because I was strong, but because I was carried. Eliam invited the young man to stay the night, and he did. In the morning, fed and rested, with a small purse of coins Eliam insisted he take, the young man prepared to continue his journey. Before he left, he asked, "Will I see you again?" "If the Lord wills it," Eliam replied, "but whether or not we meet again in this life, I pray you will find what you are seeking. And remember, the seeking itself is part of the finding. The questions are part of the answer." Years continued to pass. Eliam's beard turned fully gray, then white. His body, which had been so ravaged by disease, grew strong again, though it bore the marks of what it had endured. He moved more slowly now, but with a groundedness that came from having walked through fire and emerged refined rather than consumed. His reputation spread throughout the region. People spoke of Eliam not just as a wealthy man, not just as a righteous man, but as a man who had suffered greatly and emerged with his faith intact, stronger even than before. Pilgrims would sometimes make the journey to Uz specifically to seek his counsel, and he received them with gracious hospitality, never turning anyone away. But Eliam remained humble. He knew that his restoration was not because he had passed some divine test, earning God's favor through his endurance. It was grace, pure grace, the same grace that had sustained him in the ash heap, the same grace that had carried him through the whirlwind. He had done nothing to deserve his initial blessings, and he had done nothing to deserve their restoration. It was all gift. One particular afternoon, an unusual visitor arrived, a young scribe from Jerusalem, carrying scrolls and writing materials. He had been sent by the temple elders, he explained, to record the testimony of those who had encountered God in powerful ways. "We wish to preserve these accounts for future generations," the scribe said, "so that others might be strengthened in their faith by hearing what the Lord has done." Eliam was reluctant at first. "My story is not special," he protested. "Many have suffered more. Many have remained faithful through worse." "Perhaps," the scribe replied, "but few have heard the voice of God from the whirlwind. Few have been restored so completely after such devastating loss. And your testimony speaks to a question that every generation must wrestle with. Why do the righteous suffer? How do we maintain faith when God seems silent or even hostile?" And so Eliam told his story, and the scribe recorded it carefully, asking questions for clarity, seeking to capture not just the events, but the spiritual journey beneath them. They worked for several days, and when they were finished, the scribe read the account back to Eliam. "Is it accurate?" the scribe asked. Eliam listened carefully, then nodded slowly. "Yes, though no words can fully capture what it was to hear that voice, to be shown the majesty of creation, to have my small understanding shattered and rebuilt on firmer foundations. But yes, this is my testimony." "May I ask you one final question?" the scribe said. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you choose to go through it all again?" Eliam was silent for a long time, weighing the question with the seriousness it deserved. Finally, he spoke. "That is a question I cannot answer simply. Would I choose for my children to die? Never. The grief of that loss is something I carry every day. Would I choose to sit in ashes, covered in sores, abandoned by all but my wife, accused by my friends? No human in their right mind would choose that. But would I choose to know God as I know him now, to have encountered him not as a distant deity, but as a present reality, to have had my shallow faith forged into something deeper and truer, to have learned that his love is not contingent on my circumstances? Yes, yes, I would choose that. And somehow, mysteriously, the path to that knowing led through that valley. I do not understand it, but I trust it. The scribe nodded, recording these final words. You have given future generations a great gift, he said. Your testimony will strengthen many who walk through their own valleys. After the scribe left, Eliam returned to his routines, the daily rhythms of managing flocks and fields, of family meals and Sabbath observances, of morning prayers and evening reflections. But now he knew that his story was being preserved, would be passed down, would perhaps encourage others who faced their own whirlwinds. The thought humbled him. His suffering had not been meaningless, not because it had earned him restoration that would cheapen grace into transaction, but because it had taught him something true about God that he could now share with others. His pain had been real, his questions valid, his anger honest, and God had not punished him for any of it. Instead, God had met him in it, had spoken to him from it, had transformed it into testimony. One Sabbath, as the family gathered, one of his younger grandsons, for by now his daughters had married and begun to have children of their own, asked him to tell the story of the whirlwind again. The child had heard it before, but children love repetition, finding new things in familiar stories with each retelling. Eliam settled the child on his knee and began. When I was in my darkest hour, when everything had been taken from me, when I sat in ashes and scraped my sores with broken pottery, I cried out to God, not politely, not with careful religious words, but with raw pain and desperate questions. Why? I demanded. Why has this happened to me? What have I done to deserve this? And for a long time, there was only silence. But then God answered, the child said, knowing the story. Then God answered, Eliam confirmed, but not the way I expected. He did not explain why I had suffered. He did not tell me that my children's deaths served some greater purpose. He did not justify his actions according to my understanding of justice. Instead, he asked me questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? He asked. Have you commanded the morning? Do you know the way to the dwelling of light? What did you say? The child asked, eyes wide. I said nothing. What could I say? I realized that I had been demanding answers from a perspective so limited, so tiny, that my questions themselves revealed my lack of understanding. I was like an ant, demanding that a human explain the workings of the stars, not because the ant is worthless, but because the ant's capacity for understanding is limited by its nature. And yet, Eliam paused, ensuring he captured the paradox correctly. And yet, God condescended to answer me, not with explanations, but with his presence. He showed me the beauty and complexity of creation. He reminded me that his ways are higher than my ways, his thoughts than my thoughts. And in that showing, in that reminder, I found something better than answers. I found trust. And then you got better, the child said, and had new children. Yes, Eliam agreed, but that is not the most important part of the story. The most important part is that even before I was healed, even before I was restored, I had already found what I was seeking. I had found God, not just knowledge about God, but God himself. And that finding changed everything. The child seemed satisfied with this and wiggled down to go play with his cousins. But Judith, who had been listening from across the room, caught Eliam's eye and smiled. After all these years, she understood better than anyone the truth of what he had said. She had walked through the valley with him, had nearly broken under the weight of it, had spoken words of despair that she regretted even now. But she too had been transformed. Her faith, like his, had been tested and refined. And their marriage, which might have been destroyed by such tragedy, had instead been deepened. "Do you remember," she said later that evening, "when the grandchildren had been taken home and the house was quiet? The night before the disasters came, you quoted words to me that night, 'The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" "I remember," Eliam said. "I did not know why those words came to my lips that night. It was as if I was being prepared for what was coming, though I did not know it." "Do you still believe those words?" Judith asked. "More than ever," Eliam replied. "But I understand them differently now. When I first spoke them, they were doctrine, something I believed because I had been taught it was true. When I spoke them in the ashes, after losing everything, they were a choice, a desperate clinging to truth, even when everything in me wanted to curse and die. But now they are simply reality. They are a description of how the universe works. The Lord does give. The Lord does take away. These are not separate actions by a capricious deity, but movements in a dance too vast for us to see in its entirety. And through it all, through the giving and the taking, his name remains worthy of blessing. Even when the taking breaks our hearts," Judith pressed. "Especially then," Eliam said gently, "because that is when the blessing costs us something. Anyone can bless God when life is good, but to bless him in the ash heap, to praise him in the valley of shadow, to trust him when he seems to have become our enemy, that is faith that has been proven genuine, not because we earn anything by it, but because it reveals what was true all along, that he is worthy of trust not because of what he gives us, but because of who he is." They sat together in the lamplight, two people who had journeyed through the darkest valley and emerged still walking together, still believing, still trusting. Outside, the night was full of sounds, sheep settling in their pens, the wind moving through the olive trees, the distant call of a night bird, the same sounds that had been present on that terrible day when messengers came with news of disaster. But now those sounds were comforting rather than ominous, part of the ordered rhythm of creation rather than harbingers of chaos. Time moved forward in its steady progression. Eliam's grandchildren grew and had children of their own. His great-grandchildren played in the courtyards where he had once mourned his losses. The land continued to produce. The flocks continued to multiply. Life, that persistent force that pushes forward even through tragedy, continued its eternal work. Eliam himself grew very old, his body bending with the weight of years, his steps becoming uncertain. But his mind remained clear, his faith unshaken. He had lived long enough to see not just restoration, but abundance, not just healing, but flourishing. He had witnessed 4 generations of his family, had seen his line extended into the future in ways that would have seemed impossible from the perspective of the ash heap. One autumn evening, as the sun set in brilliant colors across the hills of Uz, Eliam asked his family to gather. He was very old now, perhaps the oldest man in the region, and he knew with the certainty that sometimes comes to the aged that his time was drawing near. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around him. Some had to travel from distant places, but they came, for they honored this man who had taught them not just how to prosper, but how to suffer with dignity, how to maintain faith when faith seemed foolish, how to trust when trust seemed naive. "I am leaving you soon," Eliam said, his voice thin but clear. "My journey in this world is nearly complete, and before I go, I want to leave you with something more valuable than silver or flocks or fields. I want to leave you with what I have learned." The family leaned in, listening intently. "First," Eliam said, "remember that righteousness is not a transaction. Do not think that if you are good, God owes you blessing. And do not think that if you suffer, you must have sinned. The universe is more complex, more mysterious than that simple equation allows. God is just, but his justice operates on scales larger than we can perceive." He paused, gathering strength to continue. "Second, when you suffer, and you will suffer, for suffering is part of being human, do not pretend to be fine. Do not hide your pain behind religious platitudes. Bring your questions to God. Bring your anger, your confusion, your desperation. He can handle it. He would rather have your honest anguish than your false piety." His eldest daughter, Jemima, was weeping quietly. She had heard these lessons before, but they carried new weight now, spoken as a final testament. "Third," Eliam continued, "remember that God's presence is not contingent on your circumstances. He is with you in prosperity and in poverty, in health and in sickness, in joy and in sorrow. The blessing is not the circumstances themselves, but his presence through all circumstances." He looked around at the faces gathered before him, faces bearing various resemblances to his own, each one precious, each one a miracle of life, continuing beyond his own life. "Fourth, treat everyone, with dignity and kindness. I have seen the wealthy reduced to poverty and the mighty brought low. I have learned that human status is as temporary as morning mist, but every person, rich or poor, powerful or weak, bears the image of God and deserves to be treated accordingly." His youngest grandson, barely old enough to understand, asked, "Great-grandfather, are you afraid to die?" The question brought a gentle smile to Eliam's weathered face. "No, little one, I am not afraid. I have met the shepherd, you see. I have heard his voice. I know that he walks through every valley with his sheep, even the valley that leads from this life to whatever comes next. Death is just another journey, and I will not make it alone." That night, after his family had reluctantly dispersed to their own homes with promises to return in the morning, Eliam lay in his bed beside Judith. She held his hand as she had held it through so many years, through such varied seasons. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked softly. Eliam considered the question. "I regret the pain I caused you," he said finally. "In my suffering, I was not always present for your suffering. I was so consumed by my own questions that I sometimes forgot you had lost the same children, faced the same devastation." "I forgave you for that long ago," Judith said. "And you forgave me for telling you to curse God." "There was nothing to forgive," Eliam replied. "You were speaking from a broken heart. We both were." They lay in comfortable silence. These two people who had built a life together lost it and built it again. Finally, Judith spoke once more. Was it worth it? All the pain, all the loss, all the questions. Was it worth what you learned? Eliam thought back over his long life. He thought of his first children, the ones who died in their youth, whose faces he still saw clearly in his memory. He thought of the days in the ash heap, the agony of body and soul. He thought of the voice from the whirlwind, the tour of creation that had shattered and remade his understanding. He thought of his second family, the gift he had never expected, the grace poured out in abundance. "Yes," he said finally, "not because the pain was good. Pain is never good in itself. But because the journey through the pain led me to encounter God in a way I never would have otherwise. I knew about God before. Now I know God. And that knowing is worth everything. The next morning, as the sun rose over the land of Uz with its customary faithfulness, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber, Eliam did not wake. He had passed peacefully in the night, his hand still clasped in Judith's, his face serene. His family mourned, as was proper. They tore their garments and sat in ashes, not the ashes of despair, but the ashes of honored grief for a long life completed. They told stories of his kindness, his wisdom, his unwavering faith. They spoke of how he had suffered and endured, how he had questioned and believed, how he had lost everything and received it back doubled. But more than anything, they spoke of how he had encountered God, how he had heard the voice from the whirlwind and been transformed by it, how his faith had been tested in the crucible of suffering and emerged refined, purified, strengthened, how he had learned to bless the name of the Lord not just in prosperity, but in poverty, not just in health, but in sickness, not just in life, but in death. The story of Eliam spread far beyond the borders of Uz. Scribes recorded it, teachers taught it, parents passed it down to their children. It became part of the great tapestry of faith, one thread among many, but a thread that spoke powerfully to a question that every generation must face. How do we trust God when we cannot understand His ways? And the answer that Eliam's life provided was not a simple formula or an easy explanation. It was something far more profound. We trust because we have encountered the one who is worthy of trust. We believe not because everything makes sense, but because we have met the one who holds all things, even suffering, even death, in hands that are both mighty and tender. We endure because we are not enduring alone. Centuries would pass. The land of Uz would change. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Languages would evolve. But the story of Eliam would endure, passed from generation to generation, a testament to faith that persists through the darkest valleys, a reminder that the shepherd walks with his sheep even when they cannot see him, a promise that suffering, while real and painful, is not the final word. And on quiet evenings, in places far from ancient Uz, people would hear Eliam's story and find comfort in it. Those sitting in their own ash heaps would recognize their experience in his. Those questioning God's goodness would find permission in his honest prayers. Those wondering if faith could survive catastrophic loss would find hope in his testimony, because Eliam's story was not just his own. It was the story of every person who has suffered and wondered why, every person who has questioned God and felt guilty for the questioning, every person who has walked through valleys so dark they thought morning would never come. His story said to them, "You are not alone. Others have walked this path. The path is real, the pain is valid, the questions are legitimate. But there is a shepherd who walks through the valley with you, who knows you by name, who will lead you in ways you cannot yet see, to places of restoration and peace." As darkness settled over the land where Eliam had lived and died, the stars emerged in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had looked down on his suffering, the same stars that had witnessed his restoration, the same stars that would continue to shine long after his story had been told and retold and told again. They hung in the darkness like points of faithful light, reminders that even in the deepest night, even in the darkest valley, there is illumination for those who have eyes to see. And somewhere, in the eternal places beyond time and space, in the presence of the one who had spoken from the whirlwind, Eliam rested, his journey complete, his questions answered not with explanations but with knowing, his faith vindicated not by prosperity but by presence. He had fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith, and now he stood, or perhaps knelt, before the mystery he had encountered in his suffering, the reality he had trusted in his darkest hour, the love he had learned to bless even when it took away. The Lord had given, and the Lord had taken away. And throughout it all, through every season of his long life, through prosperity and poverty, health and sickness, joy and sorrow, one truth had remained constant. The name of the Lord was worthy of blessing, not because he always gave what Eliam wanted, but because he had always given what Eliam needed most, himself. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The night deepened over the land. In homes throughout the region, families prepared for sleep, some in comfort, some in sorrow, each with their own burdens to carry, their own valleys to walk. And perhaps in some of those homes, parents told their children the story of Eliam before sleep came. Perhaps they spoke of his faith, his suffering, his encounter with the whirlwind. Perhaps they prayed that their children, when their own trials came, as trials always come, would remember that they did not walk alone. The wind moved through the olive groves, whispering in branches that would not remember Eliam, but bore witness to the same truth he had discovered, that life is both harder and more beautiful than we expect, that suffering is real, but so is grace, that questions are valid, but mystery is deeper, that we are small, but we are known, that we are mortal, but we are loved. Rest now, traveler. The story is complete. The journey has been walked. The testimony has been given. Like Eliam, you have heard words of faith and encountered truth that transcends understanding. Like Eliam, you carry questions that may not be answered in the way you wish. But like Eliam, you are held by hands that are stronger than any storm, kept by a love that endures beyond any valley, known by a shepherd who will never abandon his sheep. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away. Through every season, through every circumstance, through every joy and every sorrow, blessed be the name of the Lord. Sleep now in peace. The shepherd keeps watch. The morning will come, and when it comes, you will rise to walk another day, carrying with you the ancient truth that Eliam learned in his suffering and proclaimed in his restoration, that we are not alone, that we are not forgotten, that we are held in love that will never let us go. Blessed be the name of the Lord, now and forever. Amen. Oh, the gentle sound of wind continues, gradually fading. The rustle of olive leaves grows distant. Breath slows. Peace settles like dew on morning grass. And sleep, deep and restorative, comes like a benediction, like grace, like coming home.